This man gave the orders. These men carried them out. The SS. Between them, they were responsible for 9 million dead human beings. Ladies and gentlemen, the 33rd President of the United States, Harry S. Truman.
The Nazis had a murder squad, all of which were volunteers. They called them the elite, or the SS outfit. And they were the ones who were employed for the purpose of doing the murders that the Nazis wanted. They were volunteers, and they only accepted men who were heartless and who were willing, without provocation, to shoot people down and murder them in any other way, burn them up in a furnace if it was necessary.
Under the precedent of international law, the waging of war has gone unpunished. It would take a strong decision to establish the concept of punishment of war criminals.
This story is about that decision and the facts behind it. And I wanted them told, no matter whom they heard.
There were those who played the leading parts. But others were the strong supporting cast. The people who fell for the big buildup while the war machine was a-building. Building up to death coming down on other people in other nations. One after another, the other people learned what Nazism was all about. Poland learned first, and France, and Holland, and England, and Russia, and mothers, and fathers. And Hitler's children, they knew they were the master race. Only they deserved to live and win and inherit the earth.
These atrocities had to be punished, but how? Should we kill the Nazis off? That would be the same animal program which they had been following themselves. I wanted civilized trial. But to my surprise, our allies wanted execution without trial. I had a tough battle ahead of me, but that was after. First, we had to help win the war against these murderous fanatics.
If the German youth were not to grow up believing it all, believing the leader was all, that war was all good, clean, honest combat, and the 1,000-year Reich a dream to be revived, we had to do something. We came in late, But under President Roosevelt, we drove ahead with everything we had. But now, the spring of '45, the Superman and his 1,000-year Reich were falling apart. On that grandiose German opera, Curtain Coming Down. What would we do with the cast and all the Sieg Heiling chorus?
President Roosevelt, about a month before he died, had sent me to London on a mission to talk with Mr. Churchill, then Prime Minister, and with the British War Cabinet on the subject of trying the major war criminals of the Nazi regime. President Roosevelt was very anxious that they be tried so that there would not grow up the myth about Hitler and his cohorts that grew up about Napoleon.
1945. The new President of the United States, brand new to the responsibility for a decision. What would Harry Truman do?
I hadn't been in office more than 24 hours when Mr. Stettinius, the Secretary of State, came to see me and gave me a brief on what was proposed. There it was in black and white. The principal policy was the destruction of the national Nazi government and the war trials of the various criminals. Back after World War I, the Allies wanted to try the Kaiser for what they called supreme offenses against international morality and the sanctity of treaty. But he escaped over to Holland, and they wouldn't turn him over for trial. A list of 100 war criminals was given to the Germans for them to try themselves. They tried a dozen. 9 were convicted and got very mild sentences. Why, even old Field Marshal von Hindenburg, who was on the list, got himself elected president only 7 years after the first armistice of the war was signed. So was General Ludendorff. He jumped on the bandwagon the minute Hitler came along.
Even in the early days, he knew what he would do, told them in writing. It would begin small. Attention, Jews. And the warm-hearted people of Goethe and Schiller, of Beethoven and Brahms, of Ehrlich and Einstein and Mann, began the era of the master race by burning books.
You know, a lot of people never forget history, and they never learn anything from it. We weren't going to make that mistake. In the first place, in 1928, at the old League of Nations, the Kellogg Pact had been signed and agreed to, clearly and finally outlawing the aggressive war. Germany was one of the signers, and so was Japan.
Moscow, 1943. The Allies said that war criminals whose acts cannot be localized geographically because they affect several countries will be punished by common decision.
Later, at Tehran, Stalin offered a toast to the punishment of all war criminals. And he said that there were at least 50,000 of them. I also offer a toast to the firing squad, he said. 4 days after I became president, I told Congress my objective.
The laws of God and of man have been violated, and the guilty must not go unpunished. Nothing shall shake our determination to punish the war criminals, even though we must pursue them to the ends of the earth.
Pursued they were. Punished they should be for what our GIs were beginning to see with their own eyes. Crime crime as old as time, but with new names for the times. Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. Men with a mark of Cain on them. They were beginning to fall into our hands. Punishment? How?
Punishment should not be meted out without a trial. The trial was what I was fighting for. I wanted to make it impossible for anybody to say that this was just a lot of propaganda, that it didn't happen, that it was a pack of lies. I wanted to fix it so things would be down in black and white, and the evidence would be available for future generations, just like it was to us. That was the reason I wanted trials. I wanted to see that these atrocities, such as this, were punished. I was very much surprised to get the word from Judge Rosenman. It shocked me, the message that he gave me.
I discussed the question of the trial of war criminals with Mr. Churchill and with members of the war cabinet. They wanted to treat the war criminals as a political matter. This is the way they treated Napoleon himself.
I didn't want the same thing to happen to Hitler that happened to Napoleon Bonaparte. You see, Hitler was called the Beast of Berlin. Napoleon was called the Ogre of Corsica. He was exiled on the island of St. Helena, and it gave him an opportunity to make a hero out of himself by writing his viewpoint of what took place. I didn't want that same thing to happen to Hitler. I didn't want Hitler to have a chance to be made a hero by future generations, because he was anything but that. He was the greatest murderer in the history of the world. Well, I thought the leaders should be punished in proportion to the terrible crimes they had committed. But I didn't think you ought to be just rounded up and shot without a trial. That is just plain revenge. In June 1945, I gave Judge Sam Rosenman 2 jobs. One to go to San Francisco and continue the argument with Anthony Eden, and if possible, see if he can get him to agree to go along with us on the objective that we had in view. The other was to sound out Supreme Court Justice Mr. Robert Jackson and see if he would undertake the program of lining up the procedures for trying these Nazi criminals in their own countries. The end of the war was getting closer and closer, and time was of the essence. We were showering Germany with leaflets, warning the Germans we'd hold them responsible for further crime, promising they'd be ruthlessly brought to punishment. But we still didn't have an agreement on how that was going to be done. There's a good old American saying that you have to catch a skunk before you can skin him. Well, the time was getting closer when we expected to catch that skunk and skin him. Then at the end, all the Allies saw what Hitlerism boiled down to. Corpses, dead people, piled in rows, just like cordwood.
Yeskadal v'yeskadash shemei rabo, v'olmo dibro cherosei v'yamlich malchusei, v'chayechon u'v'yamechon u'v'chayei d'chol beis Yisrael.
Dachau is a suburb of carefree Munich with its happy carnival mood. The visitor to Munich may have a drink near the very beer hall where it all began. But fun and games are not confined to city streets. The visitor may enjoy the bracing air of surrounding sports-filled mountains. The visitor does not enjoy the air of Dachau, even when his name is Reichsführer SS Himmler. Could men who love children do what they did? Men who fathered children like other men? Could human beings do what they did?
I knew what war was, but it had never been like this. And I was determined, if it was the last thing I ever did, to let the whole world know just exactly what had been happening. We were collecting the evidence, and that was exactly what we were there for. I was still waiting to hear from Judge Rosenman. He finally phoned me from San Francisco, and the news was bad. He told me that Mr. Eden was still adamant.
Execution without trial, said Anthony Eden, is still the preferable course. They should be put against a wall and shot, said Pravda. The French said the entire German people was to blame. Nazism merely exploited their latent barbarism. Meanwhile, in occupied Italy and Germany, military courts were already in operation on the smaller Nazi fry. But now, the bigger prey were falling into our hands. Some of them eager to escape the Russians, thinking us more generous and forgiving, or more naive.
I was being attacked from all sides for insisting on trials. Some of my best friends went back on me in that line. The newspapers also joined in the attack.
The New York Times says, there is no need for a trial of a war criminal whose punishment has been previously determined. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch says, put them out of this world with army bullets through their heads. Turn them over to the Germans. A resurgent German democracy will deal with them, says Fortune magazine.
Even the Pentagon got into the act. Some of our high brass, and if you don't know what brass is, I'll define it for you. It's the top generals and admirals that make up the chiefs of staff of the United States Army. Well, they got into the picture because they were very much afraid that if anything happened to the general staff of the Nazis and the Italians, that their turn might come someday when they were in command. But we weren't trying the brass of Germany for their ability as soldiers. We were trying them for the savagery which they had allowed to take place during the war. Is it just, is it law that the soldier who pulls the trigger or shovels the people into ovens shall be tried for murder, and the commander who orders him to fire and the head of the government under whose activities and directives they both act shall be immune? Justice is not sublime, and law is not so futile as that. By now, we were on the doorstep of victory. Justice Jackson had made up his mind. He said he'd tackle the job.
The difficult task, which I have undertaken at President Truman's request, is to prepare and present to an international military tribunal the case against the principal war criminals on behalf of the United States.
And believe it or not, the Germans were helping. They had kept all kinds of records of what they had done. Pictures, movies, all sorts of things that showed just exactly what they were doing.
I am convinced that we have an opportunity to bring to a just judgment those who have thought it safe to wage aggressive and ruthless war. The measure of our success will, of course, depend upon the support we have from the people of the United States.
Mr. Justice Jackson told me that he was against farcical trials, like those that had been carried out after the First World War. And he insisted that we move fast, lest the war-weary German people do what the Italians did when they caught Mussolini, their Caesar. They exercised lynch law. Phoned me from San Francisco. The news is still bad. England wanted the firing squad.
Why? A concentration camp must be seen to be believed. Even then, the mind does not want to believe what the eye sees. It is a community deliberately organized for one end. The end. Now, the villagers of Dachau are denying they knew what the smokestacks were for. General Eisenhower has to force the good citizens to look upon products made in Germany. The pictures are tattoos on human skin. The president of Chicago University complains to Truman, "The excitement about war criminals will seem ridiculous a few years hence. We must treat them with justice and mercy."
I asked Prime Minister Anthony Eden to come to see me. He came, and I gave him a forceful statement on our attitude toward the trial of the war prisoners. I finally told him that he had German war prisoners, and so did we. He could handle his in his own way, and we'd give ours the trial of justice and let history decide which one of us had done right. Mr. Eden came around eventually to our way of thinking after he'd studied the matter over. And I sent Mr. Justice Jackson to Europe to set up the procedure for the trial.
Harry Truman said, "Good luck to you, and give them all that's coming to them."
Of course, this procedure had never been tried in the history of the world because it has been the custom of the conquerors to lay waste to the country they took and hang as many of the people and shoot as many of them as they could and rob all the rest. But the objective of this was to set a precedent so that wouldn't be done in case of another war. By the first week in August, we had set up the procedure, we had the indictments, and the trials were ready to go forward. And the whole world knows what happened. An international tribunal, the complainant, the conscience of mankind.
Why is there law? Why are there trials? Why is there punishment? Surely not for retribution, small payment for such slaughter, but for hope. Hope that a lesson taught is a lesson learned. Beyond this handful of master criminals, 80,000 smaller Nazis were also tried, most of them punished. It is to be hoped that all of the others, and all the world too, may have learned that man must not do such things to mankind, anywhere, ever again.
Now posterity may forget their names, but nobody can say that it never happened because of things on the record. Never again can men say, "I was following orders." And never again can men in power give such orders. It is a precedent which will last in history, and I'm as happy as I can be that we were able to establish that precedent, hoping always that there'll never be another world war or any other kind of a war. But if there is one, these people will understand that they're up for punishment if they carry on the horrors such as Hitler and Mussolini did.